up and speak to you for the next however long she wants to.
It's always the scariest moment. If I step away from the, I'm just going to hold it. Just let me know. But the scariest moment when you're being introduced is you're sitting there thinking, who are they talking about? I do that. Yeah, and I'm here today to speak. The book I've written several books, but this is the one I'm speaking on today, Hidden in Plain Sight, and it is nonfiction. And I want to talk about that and how I came, because it is a story in itself that is still unfolding, as I speak. But then I want to talk about being a writer, because I understand that people who read and people who want to be a writer are my tribe. So I will tell you how I got to be behind the podium today, which is unlikely, very unlikely. Yeah, I think that it is, I'm not sure, Harry Crews was my professor and Smith Kirkpatrick at UF, but Jim Haskins was another professor of mine, and he taught children's lit. And at first we had, because I was fresh off the boat from Jackson County, and he was a black man who'd been in the civil rights movement, and he did not suffer fools gladly, and I was always the girl in class saying, well, do you people want to, and he was like, you're out of mind. But anyway, after I got, y'all can come in, please do, if y'all want to. Yeah, y'all can come in, they can come in.
I'm just making sure there's enough chairs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you can bring more in the back, that's great.
Jim Haskins once, but I knew, the good thing for me, I had grown up in a church where we venerated elders. And you knew you could learn from someone, and I knew he was someone I could learn from, and then I actually became very close to him. Not, it's like a professional professor-student relationship, and then I took another class of his on folklore, and then we got on like wonderfully well, and he gave me a blurb for my first book. And it was exciting. He and I had Harry Crews, but before I ever showed up at the University of Florida on a needs-based Pell Grant, before I even came there, I wanted to be a writer just because I read all the time. And my father didn't make very much money, and the library was a free place to go. So I read everything. And I was raised Pentecostal, so we had all kinds of rules about everything. Couldn't dance, couldn't wear earrings, couldn't wear makeup. But in the library, my mother would let me go wherever I wanted, because she was a reader too, so she would go to her section. So when I was in 8th grade, I was reading Norman Mailer and saying, there's a different life out here. And so that gave me, and also my mother suffered from, so do I, but she suffered from a severe kind of depression. And one thing that she loved, she communicated with stories. She would not say, oh, Jan was speaking today at Trinity. She'd say, well, Jan is going to go over there at Trinity, and that's where Abby was taught, and she did this, and that's where this happened. It would be in a story form connecting you to something. So when I got to UF, I didn't know if I was going to major in history, which I love. I couldn't do journalism because I'm too introverted, and the idea of having to call people up and ask them stuff, I was like, I don't have to do that. I can write short stories. I don't have to talk to anybody. I can just make it. So that's how I went in. And back in those days, you could get into the creative writing department easily. You just signed up. But then Harry, if you did good stories or he thought you were serious, he would invite you to the real creative writing class. And oh God Almighty, let me tell you, he prepared me for the larger writing thing, because he would insult you in class, like, he would take you apart. And I was only 20 years old. If you handed in something that he thought was an old dog, that's what he'd call it, that you would, and we're in a church, but I am going to quote him verbatim here, because one night he was drunk about 90% of our classes, and after he had set us off, gave us the lecture and made us really, we were going to be writers, when we were leaving, he said, y'all really do, try, because I got to read this shit. And Harry, gave me He did tell me I'm a writer. The first time he read a short story I wrote, he said, "Are you because most English majors were going to go to law school," and he said, "Are you a greyhound? Are you heading for law school?" And I said, "No, sir, I want to write." And he said, "Oh, no, I'm not." And he said, "Then you're a writer." And from that time on, I didn't publish my first book for 14 years. But from the time Harry told me that till I published my first book, it was as real to me then as it was when I finally got a book contract. I mean, it was just real. I quit telling people because it was embarrassing, because they'd say, "Well, what have you published?" My mother had a neighbor who drove her crazy because the neighbor was always asking, what is she published? And it was like, nothing. So it was delusional. And I quit telling people. But then if you keep writing, if you do it every day, you get better. And so I started writing, but also when I was at UF, I had a class in Southern politics with Richard Scher, and he wanted me to do an independent study. I'm from Marianna, Florida, and there was a famous, infamous lynching there of a man named Claude Neal. So I had heard about it, and I knew uncles of mine had, as young teens, had been participants. So I had heard the stories. And at first, people would tell me, "Oh yeah," and they tell. But then when they found out, my mother called them and told them I was writing a paper for the University of Florida, and nothing. They would not even reply if you talked about it because they didn't want it to get out. Eventually, over time, I ended up writing the paper on something else. And over time, when I was out of UF, they would bring it up and tell me little odd pieces of it. But it was like all of these racial violence. Usually there's an oath of silence involved, and they're very serious about being, not talking about it. So, but my uncle, the one who was there, eventually, sit around and tell me a couple of things. So that's how I was introduced to that particular subject. And it was always confounding to me because, I came from my cookbook, which I published with Scribner, was called The Cracker Kitchen, and it was on Florida crackers. And every picture in it came out of my mother's picture book, her photo album, her shoebox of pictures. And so that South, the Butterbean South, and the South of churches, and was so loving. And then you had this line of incredible violence going through it. And I couldn't reconcile it. So I finished UF, and my husband was a teacher, and we moved to Newberry because houses were cheaper. Affordable housing was still an issue back then. And we moved to Newberry, and I became active. I had 3 children, 3 little girls. I became active in the Historic Society. And somebody along the way told me, "Well, Newberry had a lynching." But I would say it couldn't be, because Claude Neal was like human sacrifice. It was horrible. And I was saying, well, it couldn't be as bad as that. But my neighbors and people around me, who were all about 50 years older than me, they were widows of farmers. They would occasionally tell me little snippets. So while I was in Newberry, I wrote my first 2 novels. And after 14 years, I published My Brother Michael with Pineapple. And it won awards, and it sold as a bestseller in Germany, which is something that you don't realize happens, but it was good because they paid well. God bless them. They bought my first 3 books. And then I decided I wanted to write the same story. I'd written it from a male point of view, and I wanted to write it from the female point of view and then the child's point of view. So it's the same story written from 3 different points of view. I have a busy mind, and the more complex a project, the more it keeps me busy. So I did those, and by that time I had gone on the road. My 3rd book was picked up by HarperCollins, so I went on big book tours, and I met a man named Doug Marlette, who was a cartoonist and a writer, and he was best friends with Pat Conroy. Well, Doug and I and Pat talked on the phone all the time because he was hard of hearing, and he had a phone that made it easier to talk, on the phone than in person. And he was a love. They had all of them, or both of them, calling me, and then Doug was killed in a really tragic car accident. And so we have some seats up here if y'all want to come. or drag him to the back if you don't want to be around. Right? But so for a while I had this magical life, and Doug was killed in a car accident. He was going to speak at a high school in Oxford, and the teacher who was driving him in a storm went off the road and Doug was killed. So Pat and I really became close friends then. And he would call for years. He would call me for an hour a day. And he was like Solomon. He'd seen it all in the writing business, in life. He'd seen it all. But he was interesting and hilarious. Just, he had a lot of personal demons, lots of mental and stuff, but it made him funny. The way he dealt with the misery and the chaos of life was by being freaking hilarious, And my mother was alive, and she was like Pat. They had the same kind of mind, so I would tell Pat the mama stories and Mama the Pat stories, and so I had a magical little life there for a while. And I finally got around to writing a novel. After Cracker Kitchen, I toured for 2 years on that book. It was internationally reviewed. I mean, I could have still be going around speaking about that book. And then I just got so sick of talking about cornbread. I mean, I could shoot me. I was so sick of hearing about it. And I was literally mic'd up at the Southern Festival of Books, and Publix was sponsoring this big thing, and a tornado they had to check the weather, and standing there I thought, this is it. I can't stand this anymore. I'm going to go crazy. So that was the last, I got off the road, came home to write. And I finally tried to address that weird dichotomy in Southern life by writing a book called American Ghost. And it was writing about my father's family, really, who called themselves Melungeon, a little black Dutch. And it was just really an examination. It was difficult to write because I was learning as I went, and I was trying to keep it real. That is the thing, that when I was writing about my earlier books about a woman with severe mental illness, or about these things, or a child that had dyslexia, the thing is, I write what I know from my own experience because it makes it universal. Trends change and new knowledge comes out about things, but if you write where you were at back then, as things happen, well then, it keeps it real. And so I wrote American Ghost, and while I was waiting, if you publish in New York, it's a year and a half from when you sign the contract till the book comes out. And the first year you're doing back and forth edits, with an editor. Whitney Frick was my editor in Cracker Kitchen and American Ghost. But then there's this 6 months, you're going to go on book tours, all this is going to happen, but you're just sitting around. I don't like to start a new book. I like to give every one of my books 2 years of support, before I start writing the next novel, because it's so immersive when I write a novel. So when I was waiting in that time, my daughter called me. She was working at Shands, and she called and said, Mama, I saw a picture of a mob photograph of the Newberry lynching. And I said, it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. And she said, well, there's a guy that seems to think it does, and you couldn't see on the video, you could see him holding up, you couldn't see it. So the man's name was Dr. Marvin Dunn. Had no idea who he was. But I was intent on seeing that photograph. So I tracked him down, and I thought he lived in Gainesville. And I said, I knew a lot of very elderly people in the 80s in Newberry. And I said, I need to see that picture. So it turned out he lived in Coral Gables, and he got in his car and drove all the way to Newberry to see me. And he walked in, and I said, I'm an obsessive, so I was like, hey, what are you doing? I want to see the picture. And so he pulled it out, and it was the picture's in the book, and it was a photograph of men and young men, boys, standing around this in the dirt, turns out it's a black family, as a matter of fact, that are there. And he didn't even know it had taken place in Newberry for sure. He was just trying to find out. Someone in the 1970s that worked at the Jacksonville Public Library had gone down to the basement and came up with this little box of photographs that they didn't know what to do with because they were graphic and they were and gave them to him. So he owned them, but he wasn't sure. Well, I recognized 5 people. And one of the men who I had known, he was old, he was 99 when I knew him, but he and his son both had this particular way of standing when they're talking, they're farmers. And I knew it was him. And I knew I had been part of Dudley Farm right at the very beginning when Myrtle was giving it to the state. And some of the young men were Dudley's sons. So when I saw it, I was so shocked. And I just told him, I have to use the bathroom. I went, because I was like, what am I doing? Because it seemed like to me, for the moment, the thing that was, there was so much things we could address now that why are we talking about something that happened 100 years ago? But I didn't know that there had been a rising interest in all of this, you know, that Tricia Hilliard Nunn and different people had been writing articles and talking about Newberry, because my husband's job had briefly, we kept our property in Jonesville in our house, but we lived in Virginia and Denver. So I didn't know all of this was going on. But when I saw the photograph, finally it was the golden rule. You know, if there was a woman in the photograph, one of the corpses, and I was like, if that was my grandmother, I mean, I love family, I love genealogy, you know, and if that was my grandmother and somebody could tell me what happened, I'd want to know. So I went out and said, yeah, I know. And I told him, and he was astounded. So he left and went to Dudley, and the ranger, the curator, did identify the Dudley sons. It was a big, well, you know, it was maybe a surprise now that I've worked at collections. I think they could have figured it out, but in any case, it was shocking. So that made me start studying, because I couldn't understand why the Dudleys, I never had them connected to the lynching, how that could have happened. So when I was in Denver, I had my laptop and I started doing research into, mostly on the census, because I'm a genealogist. Ma'am, there's chairs up here if you don't mind sitting. Or there's one, okay, you good? There's one way over there, we go. So I looked at the census, I looked at the newspaper, and the advantage I had that I knew the people in Newberry and who was related to who and what happened, and I had been told a little bit, but it gave me a great advantage in figuring it out. So the story, I was talking to the just elected mayor of Newberry, who was a history teacher, and there had been some controversy about people not wanting him to talk about it. But I told him, I can tell you about it. And then in about 10 minutes, I told him the research I found, and he said, we've got to do something. We need to do an apology. And he said, I don't care if it costs me my job, we need to. And I said, so this was Jordan Marlowe. We had so he planned, and the city of Newberry sent out, it was a very brave thing to do because there was a lot of backlash, but he sent out a mayor's invitation, and we had, it was about 3-4 years ago, a Truth and Reconciliation meeting at the municipal building. And some of the people on the stage, I was there, and 2 descendants of the black families who had been lynched were there. And we told, and that night it was scary because we were thinking we'd have so many people on social media be so, sometimes not threatening, but pretty dismissive and insulting. So we were like, I'm sitting a duck up here if somebody pulls out a gun. But nothing happened. I didn't want my grandchildren to go with me that night. I had my daughter go with me, but I was just, but the thing that happened that night at the municipal building, I told, in the name of my speech was, this is what we know, because there's so much we don't know. It's never been, you know, had any research or any books or a few newspaper articles, but nothing that gave a timeline that really looked into it. So I got up and gave my speech, and then people started coming up to talk. Some of them were from the side of people that would have been, grandfather was in the mob. Some of the people were related to the victims. And it was incredible, this sense of love. And I don't understand till this day what it was, except that we were validating what people already knew. And the people that had come were curious. And it just turned into this lovely, everybody was hugging each other and at the end of it. So it was such a huge, really moving, that I knew that I had done a lot of research, but I'm not a historian, you know. And so I was in Denver, it was freezing, and I thought, if I don't write all these little details and these coincidences and these stories, I'm going to forget them. And so that whole winter when my husband was at work, I had a little desk and I wrote my speech in manuscript form. And then, because I know these kind of histories get challenged, plus I like history with footnotes. I like to be able to kick the can down the road so further historians can use it to, you know, further the history. I didn't want it to sound like it was another one of my novelist stories I could just come up with. So I did the hard work of all of the footnotes and sightings, and I wrote it. So my agent was not just doing backflips. You know, one of my biggest books had been a book called The Cracker Kitchen, which celebrated cracker culture. And so she was like, I don't know. And I did not want it to be a story about me. They wanted me to write a memoir, I guess, of how I started out a racist and turned into not. But, you know, that is the problem with these things, is to, you know, that we don't need another, I already have novels that I wrote from essentially every book you write from your point of view, even if whatever the sex or gender of everything it's you. So, and I didn't want it to be really poetic. I didn't want to turn a really tragic, nasty event into this beautiful tragedy, you know, this hauntingly beautiful and everything. So so my agent was like, well, you know, you're just trying to be difficult. But she did find me a publisher that gave me a traditional publishing contract, you know. But it came out a year ago, May, but this May, in 2 years, the rights all returned to me. Because I was so afraid that I was writing this and then somebody was going to come up to me and say, that's completely wrong. You know, that was wrong. And that has actually not happened, but I still am going to redo and add a few things when I edit it. But this was the book, and since then, Newberry made a public apology. And the people, we did it out at Pleasant Plain, which is the center of where all of this took place and where the victims of the lynching took place, who are buried. And it was beautiful because a lot of the families, some of the people have passed now, and it was shocking to them that a mayor, you know, that a public official would actually, and I have the apology, which was incredible, that he made. So we started working with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery to do the soil collecting sample in Newberry. And we did that, and we've done a lot of things. It's my stupid phone. So, yeah, just pull it out. We have vacant land for sale, not for sale in Jonesville, just sitting there for my goats. And every developer in North America wants to build a house on my goat's property. Yeah, just saying, there you go. There we go. So, but the, so that was happening in Newberry. And then in the meanwhile, I would be called on, just because of the fact that I had access to the collections at Dudley, I would be called on because people wanted to know their history. You know, right now if you go to Dudley, it's been a big chief, my problem with them is they never mention slavery. If you ask the docents about it, they've been told by the state to redirect the question. And they will say, oh, the Dudleys came from a tradition of South Carolina farming, and they brought many of them to South, but they won't tell the truth. And the fact is, Captain Dudley, who came down here, was a slave trader. That was his job. In the oral history his daughter did, that's what she said. That's how he made his money. And he did slave trading right up through the end of the Civil War. And so they were right in the middle of it. I'm going to tell you briefly the story. because this story of this family in Newberry, the story was broadly, if you heard anybody, if you ask people today, they'll say, well, there was a family of hog thieves, and the deputy went to arrest a man named Bosie Long, or to look into it, and he shot him, and that's why everybody was so mad, because the deputy was killed, and so they wiped out the hog thieves. Well, my research, and I did depend upon, it's all documented. I only have a couple of people who didn't want to be named, but most of my sources are named. That in 1916, Newberry had become a boom town because of hard rock phosphate. So there was a lot of money, and the bank was built, and the houses, and the downtown. It was even had a little opera house. It was an open town, it was like a Wild West town. It had saloons and brothels and a lot of wide open. When the miners, there were 14 mines that were around Newberry, and a good part of the workers were convict labor, and so it made Newberry. It was a lawless place. But when what happened after World War I started, Germany was their biggest buyer for phosphate, and when the shipping lanes were closed, they couldn't get their product out, so the mines started closing, and all the jobs and all the money. So the people needed to find a way to make money. And one of the ways that they found is the Swift packaging plant in Jacksonville, which would butcher hogs. Until then, the hogs in the South are closely, they're the beloved animal because you can eat everything on them. But they were feral. There weren't any fence laws. They ran around. The Dudleys had 100. And if you have ever raised pigs, they are hard to contain, especially boar hogs are really hard to contain. So they had accused a family, the Dennis family, who lived next door and had been in the area as long as the Dudleys. They accused them of, they had missing, they clipped the pig's ears so they could, it was like a brand, but they accused them of stealing pigs. But that was all kind of presented after the fact. The fact is that a deputy who was related to the Dudleys, it was Fanny Dudley's youngest brother, his name was George Wynn. He came to arrest Bosie Long with 2 other men in the middle of the night. On trial, Bosie said that he was spooked when he saw Bosie had a gun, which was a criminal. He wasn't, black men couldn't have registered firearms. And so he said as soon as he saw the gun, he shot him. And then Bosie grabbed his gun and went to shooting and ran out. So in the end, George Wynn was taken to Jacksonville, but he died. And the pharmacist who was with him, Lem Harris, he just was shot in the hand. So nobody really knows. At trial, they presented a lot of evidence that was, it caused such a huge, this is when Sidney Katz was running for governor, and he was in Marion County, right in this area, speaking everywhere, and he was this incredible, he killed a black man in Alabama, and he bragged about it, and he wore 2 pistols on his hip, and he was raging because he thought they had stolen the nomination from him. So this was the time everybody was on edge. And so they came, men from and some of them were lawmen, deputies. They came out and they were intent on finding Bosie Long, but they couldn't. So they went around to his family. His cousins were the Dennises. He was related to the McHenrys, the Dennises, the Youngs, and the family whose name has escaped me, but the Baskins. And they would go and say, "Where's Bosie?" And if they didn't, they would throw him in the car. And according to later testimony, they said they took him to the jail and arrested him for resisting arrest or aiding and abetting. They were taking him hostages. They were taking him. And they took, one of the women had a babe in arms, one of them was pregnant, heavily pregnant. The men had, the Reverend, who was older than them, he was just on his wagon coming home from market day, and they pulled him off his wagon, and that one, Bert Dennis, his brother, the first lynching was James Dennis, was the mob caught him in his front yard and in front of his wife and children shot him in the back once with a shotgun and then turned him over and shot him in the face. Just as a sign of contempt and anger. They were beside themselves. A lot of this activity took place at Dudley Farm, which you also don't hear. They were the main force. All of George Wynn's in-laws and nephews, they were the main group. So the Bosie Long was on the run. His family at one point were gathered in the Newberry jail, and so they took him out, marched him through Newberry, the old jail in Newberry. The road used to go, I can't exactly explain if you're not from Newberry. Right when you go in Newberry and the road splits, that's Lynch Hammock, and that's where they did lynchings, and it's still called Lynch Hammock. And the tree is gone, but it's still called Lynch Hammock. They marched him there, and there was, at that time, some women, the family of the men who had been on this big hunt all day, who asked him to let the women go free. They never were concerned about the men, but asked the women go free. But they would not, and the reason they would not is those women were witnesses. They had seen who had murdered James Dennis, Jim Dennis. So they were basically just, it's like if a relative of yours did a crime and they came and arrested your children or you, and you paid the price because they hung them. They took them out, and in the newspaper they said it was very humanely. You know, they did a lynch, tight. So they were lynched, and then they set 2 guards so that they wouldn't get cut down, because a lot of George Wynn's family, they had taken him to Jacksonville, and he was buried in Quitman, Georgia, where he was from, which is right on the other side of the Georgia line. So a lot of relatives and people were at the funeral. So they kept the bodies hanging all day. And a big line of tourists came from Gainesville. And one child who was there, who I have it on first-hand source, that she said the bodies were hanging there, and the little kids and her would just push them back and forth like swings. They were just there for a tourist attraction. And then the sheriff talked the mob into cutting them down. And then that night, Bosie Long had not run very far. This happened around in the area of Dudley, and up where the, we call it Farnsworth Road 241, up there, he had run that far to an uncle. In the newspaper they said they weren't related, but they were saying they weren't related because they didn't want people to lynch his cousins. But a preacher named Squire Long, the story goes that Bosie Long showed up and he arrested him. In the black community, they said he showed up to his uncle, who had property, could help him get away because he had been wounded too. And his uncle set him down and said, they've killed this many people, and they're going to still kill. They're going to kill me. They're going to wipe out your family until they catch you. And so when he found out his wife had been killed, he turned himself in. And so he turns the next morning, he shows up, his uncle takes him to Sheriff Ramsey's house. They immediately take him to spirit him away to the Jacksonville jail because they couldn't secure it here. And in order to keep the mob from continuing to burn, like the Newberry came close to having like a Rosewood event, where everything was burnt. They had a special session of court called, and so they very quickly, within 4 weeks, Bosie Long went on trial. They listened to all the evidence. He spoke, and he said what happened. He was asleep. They knocked on the door. He knew, he'd been neighbors with George Wynn his whole life. He was born on the Jones plantation. And he said, I'm taking you in, put on your shoes. And he said when he was getting his shoes, he moved his shirt, and there was a gun there, and George Wynn and the pharmacist had their guns on him, and one of them shot, and he returned fire. That was his story till the end. That's what he said happened. But the jury went out of the room, and 7 minutes later came back, and he was found guilty and sentenced to hang. And he hung in October. Within just a few weeks later, if you know where the Hippodrome's at, if you stand on the far steps, I'm sure people stood on it because thousands of people went to his public lynching, public hanging. They stood on the steps of the Hippodrome because where they hung people was right over to the side. And like 2,000 people showed up for that, hooting and hollering. And also, I heard this, that one of the reasons that Bosie, I don't know if they did it or not, but the sheriff, if it was in a case where that was that egregious and they had that much anger, they would grease the rope so it wouldn't break your neck. You would strangle for like 12 minutes. And I believe that's what they did. And so they called a grand jury in Newberry, and eventually in the ancient records in Alachua County, I found that Myrtle Dudley said a man named Robert Wells, who was a sheriff here and had always been a lawman in some capacity, that he was the man who tied the ropes out at Lynch Hammock. Well, when they did the grand jury in Newberry, I saw where the Gainesville City Commissioners paid Bob Wells to go talk to him. So they were paying the guy who did it to go talk. So there's no wonder that they said they couldn't figure out who did it. They never would, so nothing was returned against them. And in Newberry, they had taken everybody had to touch the rope, and they took an oath of silence. So people whose family, I have a dear friend whose grandfather was there. He was the supervisor of phosphate. And she never heard a word of it. People, and if you walked in a room, they would stop talking immediately if they were talking about it, because there was pressure. This was not a public spectacle lynching that went without. Gainesville had new people coming in, and they were bringing in, and Coomer and the big employers, they knew that if they chased their workforce out, it was going to cost them money. So they were saying you can't do this anymore. And as a matter of fact, when that happened in Rosewood, then Coomer moved their operations to Pasco County because it was considered too violent, too much of a lawless town. And after the lynching, I will say that I've met several descendants. They did a play at the Hippodrome based on the book called Newberry. And a man named Warren Lee, who's a direct descendant of Julia and Jim Dennis, he came from Jacksonville. And I've met some of some of the families, and they were scattered, had to change their names. I met a man who's a school teacher in Vermont, and the McHenrys changed their name to Lawson, and their complete history was just, it was killed. It was killed that night because they didn't know who they were. They didn't know, and I sent him my book because he said, we have a different way than some people. And I said, well, good, I'll send you a book because if you're a descendant, I give you books. And I sent it to him, and then he called me and said, well, that is what happened. Or, something they had a few differences but I've also, a lady just about 2 months ago, I'm going to close with this and we can talk, but a lady who grew up in Newberry, and in the 70s, she had a neighbor who was a child in 1916. His name was Mr. Cloud, and he lived behind in Newberry, the main thing, there's an Ace Hardware store. He lived right behind it. And he told her all kinds of stories about Newberry, but one of the stories was when the lynching took place, that Deputy Wynn was considered a tough deputy. And he seemed like one of those that would live forever. So when he was shot, everybody was in shock. So his father, when people would come in wagons or horses that night to report, he would go out to the fence and ask what's going on. And they'd stop and say, we're looking for him, we haven't found him yet, or whatever. So this little boy came out one time because he went out to stand with his father, and he could hear screaming, said it was women screaming. And his father, hold on, I got to demonstrate. He said that he was saying, that's women, and they were probably only 2 blocks away, leading them to where they were lynched. And he said his father put his hands over his ears so he couldn't hear them, so he couldn't hear the screams. And that was what he remembered about the lynching. And then it was a huge, you did not, when we did the historic thing, we did historic tours, we did everything in Newberry about the phosphate. It's the reason I know so much about it. But that subject was, I didn't even know about. I mean, I didn't know until I started doing the research. And so that was how this book came out, and it's still, there are a lot of things in Rosewood and in this area because it, you know, it is in classrooms. It may not, they may not be able to read it right now, but it'll be there. My family's been in Florida since 1830 in Jackson County, so I see a lot of governors go and come. So sometimes they please me, sometimes they don't. But I'm still here. I'm still telling my story. So I would like to answer questions. If you want to ask me about writing and how I actually broke in or anything. Got questions about writing? Got questions about the Newberry history?
Do you do all your own research?
Yes. I do use books, you know, in the bibliography, like I used research from, there was one in-depth news story by a man named Ron Sachs, he was award-winning journalist in 1977, and he talked to the first people that were there, and based on that, and also Myrtle Dudley for Florida Folklife did all these oral histories, and they're digitalized, you can search them at Sam Proctor, you do it from your laptop, and it's pretty shocking to read them. But I quote her in the book, but it was, they were never at pains to cover it up. I mean, you know, Frank Dudley told exactly, they didn't want to tell the exact details because I have found in any of these areas where you have a racial, as long as it's not known, it's scary, it's like a ghost. It's like this, you know, disembodied evil demon that's all powerful. And if you write it out and tell who they are, it's not the disemboweled, you know, it's human beings that were in a situation where it was like a storm building, and the storm, and then finally electricity and lightning, and then things happen. But it was, and some people in Newberry regretted it, you know, and some people, as in always, same thing in Mariana and in Rosewood, there were people who told the mob, do not do this thing. This isn't 50 years ago in Florida. We have a courthouse. We have judges. You know, they'll let the courts take care of this, let them decide, but they didn't want to. I think that in 1916 in Newberry, because Dudley's family had been not only slave traders, they had been overseers in the plantation days on those terrible rice plantations in South Carolina, and that was a little glimpse of slavery, you know, and the disrespect for lives, for black lives. That was a little glimpse in that we saw in 1916. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned Dr. Patricia Hilliard.
Yes.
How did you dovetail with her work? Or
Well, when I started doing research, came upon her name. So when I would come back to Newberry, her house was still here, and I just did a cold call and said, hey, I'm a woman in Newberry, and so I wanted to ask you about your work, because she had been doing oral histories in Black Alachua County, and in the lynching. Yeah, come on in. Oh, come, we're cool. But she had done and the subject kept coming up because people, and so she started studying it, and she, like I, were haunted by it. We weren't, because I would start, you know, I felt very awkward writing I'm not a historian, and I was like, man, I am going to get killed by, you know, writing history. It's, and especially in a subject controversial, but Tricia really encouraged me to do it, and she also had done all these oral histories over the years, and she gave me the exactly where I could find the quotes and the things. So and that's who I dedicated the book to. And she, I don't know if y'all know, she passed, we were writing, she and I were writing the wording for the Newberry EJI monument, and she was such a strong woman, not a whine in her. I knew she was ill, but I didn't know. And I had gone down to the beach with my husband and children for a birthday, and I got the call. It was she and I, while we had been emailing the last few emails, she was in the hospital. She told me, oh, I've been a little sick, so I'm going to go slow, but we were bouncing it back and forth, and then somebody called me and told me she had passed. But she was an incredible force, and I worked, grew on the work she had. First time we met, that was our joke, is she knew all of the Gainesville stories and Gainesville names, but she didn't know anybody once you got past the Gainesville line, Jonesville, Newberry, and she mentioned somebody, and I said, I know them. I know where they live. I'll take you where they live. Yeah, I know where they're relative. So we were able to connect.
And she's buried in Pleasant.
Yes, and that was the cemetery at Pleasant Plain where the lynching victims were buried. And she and I have been there, and it was, you talk about the Twilight Zone. The first time I went back where her grave was there, and she's within. I love J.J. Baskin's grave. He was the Methodist preacher, and his congregation didn't know he'd been killed because they all lived out in the country, and they got together that Sunday not knowing he had been killed. And she's very, very close to J.J. Baskin's. And if you go to Pleasant Plain, the graves are in the very back, close to the back, and you'll see the McHenrys and the Dennises and families, and they have the most beautiful markers, like Father of, I have it in the book, and what the Baskins family, Father of Love, you've gone to your reward. It's not that, and I also trace where it happened to their children, the ones who I could trace their names, and they became like, when one of the Reverend Baskin's daughters died only about 15 years ago down in South Florida. A lot of them went down to Riviera Beach, and am I saying that right? To the Riviera Beach? And when they died, in the newspaper she says, I was born in Jonesville, Florida, and my father was J.J. Baskins, and my mother was Ellen Baskins. And then she had been like an activist and really active in her church and community her whole life. And when I was reading, I just got, I was in full obsession mode by then, and I was reading my husband, and I said, yeah, it sounds like they had a hog stealing ring, but they had a lot of pride. It's a beautiful story. I had people reach out to me, and we did the play, and Warren Lee was there, and he talked about growing up knowing that there was this huge secret, but no, there's a huge shame involved. One of James Dennis's, I met one of his sons, who was a quite elderly man, who was there for one of Tricia's speeches, and he was just adorable. And I was talking to him, and he was telling me he was 87 years old, and I was like, well, you look good. You look better than I am. And I'd just flown in and was ragged. And he, then someone, Dr. Ken, Tricia's husband, asked him, said, do you remember it in your family? Did you ever talk? And he had been he's a deacon at a local church. He's passed now. He was smiling, and as soon as he said that, he said, no. And it was like, just a, and Tricia had a lady who was who was there, who had agreed to speak. She's from Jonesville. And she would eat, back then they did senior lunches at the Newberry Municipal Building. And she was going to speak. She wasn't very happy about it because she would have like post-traumatic, after all these years since 1916, she would shake when she would talk about it and get really nervous. And then when she went to eat in Newberry, she said, you know what, I'm not going to talk about it. Because she was having lunch at Newberry and they were kind and it was a different thing. She didn't want to cause trouble for anybody, so she wouldn't speak. But stories are trickling in now. This book has been out and shared in a lot of families, and sometimes they call me before reunions, and I'm going to say, man, y'all got a lot to talk about at this reunion, and Yes.
Yes, I would like to know
First of all, I wanted to say the silence is a deadly, deadly weapon.
Mhm.
And I was wondering about our children, all of our children. How will they ever learn
Mhm.
about the history in Florida,
Mhm.
in the South?
Well, this was already, we had a curriculum that some University of Florida professors had written, and this was one of the books, that was going to be taught. And that it still is being, it still is. But I think that it takes, and we're trying to do that right now. Dr. Dunn is doing a group where he brings students from Miami and from places, a lot of them, and they come and they go to the Moore House in Mims and Newberry and Rosewood. And I sometimes go and speak to them. And these are high school students and college students. It takes sensitivity because it's such a difficult subject. And so you have to have it like this where everybody can talk. But I've never seen anyone, I guess the reason they don't want to teach the woke thing is because they think it'll be such a burden. And I come from a family that my family was slave owners, and they were I'm not a Dudley, I'm not up in West Florida, but I have that, and I don't feel the weight of guilt. I want to just feel, and I want my grandchildren to have the freedom of telling the truth and not thinking that, like we did, grow up in a community where it was really a war, and the war was based on the color of your skin. And I want them to be able to be, I raise my daughters that way, and they've raised their children that way, which is the biggest reward, I think. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the docents at Dudley Farm are not allowed to address the subject. They've been instructed to sidestep. Is there any avenue of approach to have that changed?
Well, I tried to. One of Tricia's things was she told me, I lived very close, I lived 5 minutes away, and she said, you need to be a docent, because you change from within, And part of the reason that the state doesn't want to talk about it, because it's so awkward, it's just awkward to say. And they had made Dudley, now they've changed it somewhat, but they had centered the whole park. It was like a Disney. The mule was named Fred, and the mare was Dolly, named after, they had made it into a very sanitized, hard working. If you listen to the little spiel they talked about, it was about how hospitable and how great neighbors they were. And it was shocking. But the thing they won't let you talk about is slavery. And they say it's because they're a federal historic landmark. They just got federal status. But they say that they only go from 1880 till now. So slavery was before that. But in the collections at Dudley, they have drawers. I can take people on there. They gave me the codes to go in. And they have, quite a few are documented in Tallahassee, but a lot of them aren't. And they're from plantation books, both in South Carolina and here. And they're huge papers, and there's just line after line after line of slaves and their age and their sex, and usually that's all. And these were people that he was bringing, and we have transactions where he was saying, I'm going to take 3 slaves because I think I can sell them in Florida. And there is no doubt, it's in collections. But if you ask about the lynchings, they have great, I've become friends with the park specialist and the CSO, and that's the reason they gave me all the codes. They want me to do the work. They're the people on the very bottom being told what to do, but the people in Tallahassee who are making those decisions.
Who are those people?
It's the Department of Natural Resources. That is the Department of Natural Resources, and And it's absolutely whitewashing history. I mean, I am, because when I came back, I was in Denver when I wrote the book, and then I came back and spent a lot of quality time sitting in collections, reading letters, it was really interesting. But, because Myrtle Dudley was a hoarder, so she has all this incredible information there. But I was like, how did they deny that? How can this be? But I was at Cane Day, and a lady who used to be the park ranger, nice woman, very knowledgeable about Florida plants and about natural stuff. And a man from Denmark was asking inside the house, because I was standing behind Terry, the ranger, and he said, was this what y'all would call a plantation house? And Terry, just smooth as she could be, she said, well, the Dudleys came down from South Carolina, and they carried the traditions of South Carolina to Florida. And then she said, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot what you said. And I said, plantation. He was asking about that. And she looked at me like, get out of here. But, yeah. And so, yes, ma'am?
Myrtle Dudley donated
Yes.
Dudley Plantation to the state.
Yes.
She was given some kind of an award or recognition. Do you think that was appropriate?
Well, I've had people who knew her very well, who I met her when I wasn't close friends with her, but I had met her before. And I think it's very valuable, her oral history, because she is just saying the way she was raised, and it's shocking. But she was given the Florida Folk History Award, and I don't know who made that decision, because technically they already knew, like, if they had rangers come and one of the rangers was black, they were going to do work and they were going to eat, and black people weren't allowed in the Dudley house, and she wouldn't let him eat there. So all the rangers ate outside in solidarity. But they knew that that was an absolute thing. Plus, Myrtle would sit around and tell those poor rangers stories that made their hair curl. I mean, it was absolutely known. It's just, they know, and when I go and volunteer, they know. I do know one of the other volunteers told me that when the slavery question came out, there was a young man that's a professional archivist, which is a really valuable job, and he's really good at it. He quit. He took a job further south because he wasn't going to perpetuate it. It was absurd. So, but they still teach it.
I want to take one more question and then
Sure.
let everybody know where you're
Oh,
going to be
okay.
sitting.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
just wanted to know, how is your book available, on Amazon or?
Yes, it's Amazon. We're selling it downstairs on table 4, right when you walk in, and we're selling the paperback, and it's on Amazon. Anywhere you can buy books online, they may have it at the bookstore at Millhopper. They may have some there, but they have some at Sycamore Lane, but they sell out a lot really quickly. And this is the one that's the original. This is the original one. It's going to be different. So this is the one that's going to be the collectible. Can I ask one more? Somebody was back here. Yes, ma'am.
The history is shocking, and I'm curious about the lynchings, if they were the final lynch, or if there's more lynchings, or if these lynchings were the last lynchings in the area.
No, there were more lynchings. They have in Alachua County, they have a count. And in Rosewood, when Rosewood burned down, there was a man lynched in Newberry that same weekend that was connected. But I haven't done the study to figure it out. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I have a listing of all the lynchings that occurred in Alachua County from the time of Reconstruction to the 1960s, and there were 49. I believe that was the number. And I received those before we went as a group in a bus to the lynching, the memorial.
The EJI, memorial in
Montgomery, Alabama. And that whole trip was really worth going to. I would never go again, but it was worth going to.
Yes, it is. And the EJI has been incredible. Yeah, they're incredible to work with. They're
I have a listing of all those names.
Okay. All right, I'll be at table 4 if anybody
Yeah,
wants to.
so good.
Sorry about the time, Rose.
I'm gonna walk down with you to our
Really good.
Excuse me, is that okay?
Yes.
Well, I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, it is, that's right.